Is it possible to write an obituary about a living person? Let's find out. By the way, if you like this video, please remember to hit the like and subscribe buttons. This is a new channel and every subscriber helps. Thank you. Today we were speaking to Glenn Rifkin, business book author and New York Times contributor. Glenn, great to speak to you today. I know you've been writing obituaries for the New York Times for about 10 years. And you told me earlier that when you first started writing obituaries for the Times, you learned that many of the obituaries are written ahead of time before someone passes away. Can you tell us about that?
They call them advance obituaries. They're done while the subject is still living. And it's a long practiced concept that the Times and other newspapers and media outlets do it too. I just had not heard of it. And it seems sort of grim, like we're writing your obituary, but you're still here.
Is it challenging writing obituaries, writing about death?
The obituary is hardly anything at all about death. It's actually a story of a life. It's a personality profile. It's a sense of who this person was, what they accomplished in this world. And so I loved writing pieces like that. So this seemed like a natural.
I've heard that there are over 2,000 pre-written obituaries in the New York Times. How many of those have been authored by you just waiting to be released?
I can't even guess. It's probably over 100 by now after 10 years. Although, along the way, when the person has died and that's happened, then we run those obituaries. And so that draws down on the list. I've done a lot of them. I've never really counted, but I do have an interesting trait, which is that if I write your advance obituary, you just keep living and living and living. I have people who have just been going on for years and years. So I'm like the reverse curse. You basically, if you're going to have an advance obituary done, you want me to write it because you'll just keep going. So
that's right. I was going to ask you, actually, how does it feel knowing that the pieces you're writing won't be read by the public for years or even perhaps decades in the future?
Well, it's an interesting conundrum for a newspaper journalist because, the byline, anybody who's a journalist knows how valuable the byline is to your work because generally you're not making a ton of money. You're doing it to get the visibility, to make a difference, to have the last word about somebody. So when I'm doing this, I don't want somebody to die sooner than later, but I know that my article will not appear until that happens.
I'm sure you can't talk about the people who are currently in the New York Times vault of pre-obits, but perhaps you can talk about some of your obituaries that have already been published that are about notable people. And I know one person you wrote about, William Goldman, who wrote the screenplay of probably my most favorite movie, The Princess Bride. Maybe you can talk about that.
Sure. William Goldman was really a powerful force in Hollywood in late 60s and then beyond that. He was the first superstar screenwriter who ever worked because his movies were just unbelievable. William Goldman wrote Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid, for which he won an Oscar. He followed that up with All the President's Men, which he won another Oscar for. He was a guy who was starting to get paid like $400,000 for a script back in the 60s when that was a lot of money. And, if his name was attached to a film, that really mattered at the box office. People actually thought about it when they were going to a William Goldman film. So he was just a larger than life character. And and you mentioned Princess Bride, which I totally agree with you. It's a movie I could watch over and over again. That's a great story. And it's in the obituary that Goldman, he wrote a book called The Princess Bride well before it was a screenplay. And when he wrote the book, he wrote it with it very much in mind that it would become a movie. But no studio wanted to make it for some reason. And he was frustrated as heck. And I think it was, I'd have to check, but I think it was at least 10 years before he found a studio and a director who turned out to be Rob Reiner to take it on. Needless to say, when that obituary ran in the New York Times, it was on social media, it was tweeted all over the world. I got letters and emails from, even some other actors got in touch with me asking me to write their obituaries. So it was a game changer for me.
Well, Glenn, tell us a little bit about Marvin Minsky. I know you wrote about him as well.
Sure. Another one, larger than life figure. Again, if your listeners don't know him, he was basically the founder of AI. He was the guy who many credit for beginning that whole discipline. He was a lifelong MIT professor. He was a true Renaissance man, and he was a character. I had the chance to sit in on some seminars that he gave. I didn't understand a word that he was talking about, but then again, I'm not a science and technology guy, so I did the best I could. But Minsky really changed the world, and he was known as a generous mentor. Some of the greatest names in the AI field studied under him or worked with him. He would invite young scientists to come from other parts of the country and move into his house in Brookline, Massachusetts. They had an attic that was all finished, and his wife just looked at it. They were like extended children. And he was just this amazing, brilliant thinker who saw the future, and he saw it built around artificial intelligence, and that there would come a day when machines would learn and think and potentially take over the world. And when he died, again, the response to my article in the New York Times was stunning. It was just all over the world. Maybe the most read piece I've ever written, just because of who he was. It wasn't because of me. It was because everyone wanted to read about Marvin Minsky.
You know, during the past 12 months, you've had to change how you write obituaries. And I know you have a new series called Those We've Lost. Can you talk about that and how you're remembering the people who've passed away during this terrible pandemic?
I'd say a couple of months after the March lockdown, the New York Times decided that it would need to address this in the obituary section. People were dying in record numbers. The city of New York was overwhelmed. So they started a new section of the obituaries called Those We've Lost. Really, it was very simple in its premise. Let's honor some of the ordinary folks, some of the people who aren't famous, aren't rich, aren't notable. They're just people who have died from COVID. And we'll write obituaries about them, but they'll be shorter. They'll be, maybe half the length of a regular New York Times obituary. Part of the reason for doing these was after 9/11, the Times did a series about each and every person who had died in 9/11. And it was a powerful series that they had run for months after 9/11, when almost 3,000 people had died. And we thought, it was just horrific. And it was just horrific, a day that no one will ever forget. But under COVID, we were losing that many people every day. And it's just mind-boggling to think of that. So I started to jump in and help out with those. And they were very different to write, as you said. The reason being, these were not advanced situations where I was writing about somebody who was still alive, somebody who I probably wouldn't speak to about it. But more than that, it put a name and a face to some of these numbers. The statistics, you get what I call the anonymity of large numbers. You can't put your head around it. But if you take one person and you tell their story and you talk to their relatives and then get it down and get it into the paper, it's a powerful, powerful thing. It's a powerful thing for those of us reading it who don't even know who they are. And it's even more powerful for the families and friends to see that this life that they lost, and so tragically, will at least be remembered, And so I started to write those, and it was incredibly heartbreaking. I mean, I'm human too. Obituary writers need to find a way to create a space between death and the things that they're writing. Because if we were overwhelmed emotionally about every single person we wrote about, we would be in bed all day and we couldn't leave a dark room.
Can you talk about one or two people that really struck a chord when you were writing about them?
Yeah, they all struck a chord, but I will mention Elvia Ramirez, a young girl, 17 years old, who died in October in North Dakota. She was a Native American, and she was a senior in high school. She had her whole life ahead of her and all sorts of good reasons to want to live. She was going to get married to her high school boyfriend. She had siblings, young siblings, who she was had promised she was going to take to Disney World. She had dreams and expectations of the world ahead. And then she came down with COVID. You know, the Dakotas back then were brutal. They were leading the nation per capita in cases. And I spoke to Elvia's mother, whose name is Susan Three Irons, and she was sobbing on the phone to me while she told me about how she had to sit away from her daughter. She couldn't even be in the same hospital room with her daughter. She was somewhere away. And the doctor put a phone up to her daughter's ear after she died, just so she could say goodbye. And, you know, you can't be human and not be affected by that. And I had tears in my eyes when I was writing this piece. And, you know, it was about honoring her. It's a very different kind of obituary. You need to really steel yourself when you're doing something like that. And I'm still writing them. They're still happening. And I was still doing my other obituaries while these were being done. So it's a fascinating field.
Does writing about obituaries make you think of your own mortality? And do you ever think what might be in your own obituary?
Well, hopefully no one will write good riddance. You know, I think more about my mortality because of my age more than the fact that I write obituaries. I don't spend a lot of time thinking about that. I do think more and more as I get older about how I spend my life and how I spend my time and what, you know, I got a lot less ahead of me than I have behind me. So what do I want to do with it? And I think writing obituaries does give you perspective and say, you know, look at these folks, look at the really notable people who lived such full and energetic lives until the very end. They weren't giving up. They were ready to keep going. And, you know, we all die. It's just, that's the one deal we can't break. And it really comes down to, you know, how do you spend your time? I hope that I spend my time, you know, reasonably well. I watch too much Netflix, but I probably feel pretty good about my life. And, you know, and I do think that when the time comes, the irony is I won't get an obituary in the New York Times. I haven't done enough to earn one. And they don't just write about you because you were a writer for them. You know, you have to have a level above that to be eligible, so to speak. So I've still got a few years to really, you know, knock it out of the park maybe and get one. But if I died tomorrow, I would not be in the New York Times.
Well, I hope you don't die tomorrow. You have many decades to come.
I'm counting on it.
But Glenn, thank you so much for speaking with us today. I greatly appreciate it. And is there anything you'd like to leave the listener as we wrap up about your work in writing obituaries?
Sure. I do think that Carl Reiner had it right, the wonderful comedian and writer who recently died. He used to tell people that every morning he would get up, he would open up his New York Times, he would go to the obituary page, and if he wasn't on it, he'd make breakfast. And I think that's the attitude we should all live with. You know, read the obituaries. You would be amazed. They're not grim at all. They're actually incredibly interesting. You could read about the life of the guy who invented the slinky and the guy who created the pink flamingo lawn ornament and people who've done amazing things who are just not household names. I think obituaries, the time has come, and I think the reason they're so popular now is because people have really caught on to the fact that the last word can sometimes be the best word.
Well, that's a great way to end it. Thank you so much, Glenn. I greatly appreciate it.
You're welcome.
I hope you liked this video with Glenn Rifkin. More information about Glenn is in the notes below. Remember, if you like this video, please hit the subscribe button and the like button. As a new channel, could use your help. Thank you so much. See you next time.